Hi, welcome to Pay It Forward. Now today is a much requested pattern. Well, I keep getting asked for chickens and I love chickens myself and I have raised chickens for years too. So I was pretty keen to make this one and it was fun to design. So I've got a beautiful little chicken pincushion slash caddy. She's big enough to hold all of your clips and bits and pieces. And she's very easy to make, and I have made her up in felts, but you can make her up in fabric because I know some of you prefer fabric. So you just need a really good pattern. I've got that all ready for you and it's free, of course. All you need to do is click on that link in the description below and you can download your free pattern templates. Now make sure that you do set your printer to print at actual size in the settings, and that will make sure your template, your pattern pieces are all exactly right. So what are we waiting for? Let's get busy. So to get started on our little chicken, let's first run through your materials and requirements. Now I've made up this little one fully in felt, and I'm also going to be making this little one in felt. You can make this one up in fabric. The difference will be, you have to remember that we're going to be closing this little section here, which will be a raw edge in fabric. You must make sure that it's very well interfaced if you're just using fabric on its own. We will still be able to close that edge. It just won't have that real plump look. The nice rounded plump look tends to come from using the felt, but it will still definitely work. That's not a problem. Another alternative is to go for making it up in a felt fabric. Now felt fabric is something that I've created, and it is just felt and a piece of print fabric fused together, joined together with fusible webbing or heat and bond. And it creates a lovely flexible fabric, but it has all of the properties of felt. So you've got a lot less fraying and you've got that lovely bouncy sort of substance to it. So that's a good alternative. I have a video that shows you how to make this one up, and also it shows you how to make up your double felt, which we'll be needing. I'm going to put that link up the top there for you. If you're choosing prints for this little project, I do think that tight and busy prints work best. Absolutely, for sure. And I would probably still make the wings in coordinating felts. So you can imagine some lovely paisleys and that sort of thing would work really well. But moving forward, I'm just going to be using my felt. So I have my two main body pieces and they have my fusible woven interfacing on them. And then I need my little base pieces. Now my little base pieces, of course, they can be a fabric as well. They can be a print. I'm just indicating a type of a basket or a bowl, and you can amplify that any way you like, but you may even be able to get a little basket weave print that could work really well with that. I'm just going for the black felt. I'm going for blacks, reds and whites and greys this time, so we don't have to stay completely traditional. So you need two of those and they have heat and bond on the back. You'll then need your wing pieces. Now your wing pieces are cut from double felt, so that video will help you out. Double felt is just two pieces of felt joined together with heat and bond, and you can see I've got two different colours there. You don't have to do that, it can be all the same colour. I just like that little bit of red showing behind. And so a little wing section goes on there. Then we also need our little wing extra piece which has heat and bond applied to the back, and that will sit there. And we will also need our little pieces. So we need our little wattle pieces. So our little wattle pieces are these little pieces here, and we need two of those, and they're also cut from double felt. And you can see that I've got the other one already sewn, so I would have two of those. And then we need our comb pieces. So our comb is the little comb that sits at the top of the head there. They are cut from felt with fusible webbing applied to the back. There's a reason why we do that, and I will show you that as we get to that part. So we need those two little pieces. You're going to need your beak pieces. Your beak pieces are also cut from felt with fusible webbing applied to the back. We're not going to be fusing it, but we use that for strength. And by the same token, we have our little chick. If you're going to be making your little chick, then we need to have those two pieces. Now I've already stitched my little chick up to save a bit of time. Those two little pieces also are cut with fusible webbing on the back, and that's not to fuse, it's just to keep that felt a little stronger. And so that's what we need to do with that one. And we're also going to need a base. Now I'm using my wooden discs because I have them, which is the right size. Now the base is just going to give us some stability at the bottom there. If you have a wooden disc that size, that's perfect, you can use that. This one is a 50mm. Ideally it would be slightly bigger. You'll find your pattern template for it shows you that it's slightly bigger. This is a piece of mat board, 2 pieces of mat board that I have glued together with PVA glue, and you can create your own little discs that are just as strong. This is just as strong as that little wooden one, so just cut that to your template size. I get my mat board from little offcuts from my local picture framers. We're going to need extra strong threads, and we're going to need some embroidery threads just to suit your little project. We're going to need a couple of tiny little black buttons for the eyes. I'm using Doll's buttons here, they're very small. So we're going to need 2 of those. You could possibly use just black beads if you like. We're also going to need 2 suitable little buttons for attaching our wings. They don't have to be exactly the same, mine are slightly different, and that will still work. A little bit of a trim perhaps for your little basket there. So again, this could be anything. I just like the idea of breaking that line up with a little bit of lace or a little bit of a trim. Something with a little bit of tiny bit of gather would be nice. Even a little bit of fringing that might indicate the little nesty sort of a look. So totally up to you. Maybe you just want a piece of rickrack, or alternatively you can just blanket applique that line with a contrasting colour. And we're going to be filling our little chicken with polyester filling, so you need some of that. And definitely, if you have one, you need to grab your wool felting needle, because that's going to help us when we're stuffing all of the little parts of our little chicken. And we also need a felt disc for the base, which is just going to tidy up the bottom and be a nice finish. So that one is also cut from double felt, or just interfaced felt will be absolutely fine. So I use a mixture of perlé threads and my extra strong Gutermann thread for doing my sewing details, so that's entirely up to you. So to get started, the first thing that we do is we're going to take our side pieces, our side body pieces. On your pattern templates you'll see that you've got the front marked in. Make sure that you note which one is the front. So you can put it on the right piece, and we're going to take those and we're going to fuse those into place. Using a hot iron and a protective cloth. Make sure that it's all lined up, and we will press those into place. Once I've got my little base pieces pressed on there, my next step is I'm going to add, because I'm adding a trim, this is when I do it, and I will just be popping that little piece of lace. I'll extend a little either side. I'm just going to use just a little machine zigzag stitch just to attach that along that top edge there. Of course you can use any braid at all that you like, or any kind of trim, or you could, if you wanted to, you could just sew a blanket applique stitch across there. So I'm just going to go and do that with both of my pieces on my little chicken base there. So now that my little lace trim is in place, our next step is to put our little chicken together, right sides together, and make sure everything is lined up. And we're going to be sewing with a 4mm seam allowance to keep that nice and small, because we're not going to be trimming our seam at all. So the areas that we're going to stitch, I want to make sure this is very well lined up, so that when you get to put your little chicken together that everything meets up nicely. So make sure that they are nicely lined up there. Now where we're going to be sewing, you can use your little clips or pins, whatever suits you. The first seam we're going to be sewing will be from that base. Make sure you're back and forth, and we're going to sew up until this little bottom edge here. We're leaving this little mouth section open. So just this one first, and I sew every seam 2 times for strength. The next seam we sew is the top one, and that is from the top of that beak section there, right the way around until this top edge here. Same thing, back and forth whenever you start and finish. And then our final seam is from this little mark that you'll have on your pattern down to the base there, and the same thing back and forth. So this little section here is actually left open. So those are the 3 seams that we sew, 4mm seam allowance, and we sew those twice. My chicken is all stitched together there, and my next step is to turn it through, and I will have that done helping with my knitting needle and my forceps. So just turn that one right the way through, and I have that all through, and I have just gone around, pushed all those seams out and rolled them out so that they're nicely curved. Check that you've got your little junctions there have met up well, and they have, and make sure we've got all those seams nicely pushed out. Now the first thing that I'm going to do there, if you can see my little chicken's mouth, there's a little hole there, there's a little space. What we're going to do is just, all we want to do is bring those 2 seams together. We just want to close that opening. You can see that there. I've just got my extra strong thread, and this is not anything that is going to be seen. It's just to close that opening. So we can just do the quickest little tacking stitch, so that when we're stuffing our little chicken that we don't have anything escape through there, and it also gives us a nice clean seam to add our little beak to. So our little beak actually goes right over the top of this one. So you can see it's really just a few rough little stitches to keep it all tidy into place. Snip that one off. Just push that seam back out, and that one's already there. Now our next step is to just stitch our little tail section closed so that our stuffing will only go to here. You can see that there across there. So I've stitched from the base of my little scalloped edge there, from my base just across. Now there's no real measurement here, and you can draw a line if you like, if that makes it easier for you. So we're just going to be stitching from the base just across on the machine, and I just do that 2 times in a coordinating thread, and that will just settle that one into place, and then our stuffing can only go to there. And then we're going to close this little section here and keep it all nice and flat like the little tail feathers. We're going to close that with a blanket stitch, but for now I'm just going to take that one to my machine and stitch that one across. If you find it easier to manage, throw a little bit of craft glue in there first and seal it, and then do your stitching. That's absolutely fine. You can go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do that one now. So there you can see my little stitching line across there. So now I'm going to just sew a blanket stitch on this section here. So the colour is entirely up to you depending on your project. I'm going to go with the black to really mark that little tail, those tail feathers out. So I'm using my black pearl thread here, just a single strand, and you can see I've come in between those 2 layers there, right on that edge there, so that I can hide my knot. I've got a knot in the end, and I'm going to hide that in between those layers. I'm going to tuck that in nicely, encourage that in there, and then I'm going to sew a blanket stitch. Now my first stitch will be right on this corner here. Now a blanket stitch is very simple to do, very, very useful stitch, and I'll make 2 right there. So blanket stitch is you're going through both layers and you're coming out through the loop with your needle and thread each time. I've got a video that shows you exactly how to sew the blanket stitch. I'm going to put the link up there for you and you can have a look at that one. And otherwise I'm just going to make my way down, making sure that my edges are held together nicely. My stitches are probably about 3 millimeters, like a little boxed square. You can see what that's going to do. It's going to create that little edge that's going to cover and conceal my little raw edges there. You can see that happening. So I'm going to make my way down, right down to the little base there. So that's my little tail section all stitched and done. So now we can move ahead and start to fill up our little chicken from the base there. I'm using my forceps to do this. It makes the job so much easier, and it's just a matter of getting right in there. So we start with the head section and we really want to fill out that little front beak section that we've stitched up there, because that's a nice, if you make it nice and firm, it's a nice firm base for sewing our beak on. Anything in soft sculpture is easier to manage and sew if it's packed nice and firm. Makes your job way simpler. So I'm going to add just some little pieces at a time and really fill out that little head, paying particular attention to your little curves and corners and watching that you're getting a nice rounded finish as you go. So we'll do the same once we get this next section filled. Now you might find that your stuffing wants to come back at you. It wants to be jumping out at you. Once you've got your neck section filled down to about here, and it's really nice and firmly packed and everything's looking really good through here, it's a simple thing just to throw a pin through and it'll hold your stuffing up there while you're doing the rest. Of course we're going to be using our felting needle, so have that ready because we're going to be packing this stuffing in when we get to the top. But for now, throwing those little pins in those sections allows you to continue, and this part of the stuffing isn't dropping down, and the same applies for up here. So you'll be tucking your stuffing in right up here, get it all packed out nice and firm. Just throw a couple of pins in while you're continuing to fill this body section. You'll find it'll help a lot. So I'm going to keep filling my little chicken right up to the top here, and we can get it really filled to the top here because then we're going to be pushing it down, we're going to be packing it down, and we want to make a nice flat surface. So you can go ahead and get that little one filled. Once you have your filling right up to the base here, you can take your felting needle, and of course my pins are taken out now, and you can just start packing that one down. We're going to create a nice flat base there. And you might feel like when you first start with your felting needle, you might think, oh, we're getting absolutely nowhere here. But just keep stabbing away, and it does. You can see there that it just packs in nice and flat. Do be aware of your fingers. I've said this before, you'll only get yourself once, and we've all done it. Keep your fingers right out of the way, and also by the same token, don't go right through your fabric with your felting needle, because these are so effective that it will take those fibres straight through your fabric, and they're very hard to pull out afterwards. So just keep it short little stabs, and you can see that we're getting a really lovely flat little surface there. Really tuck it into the sides, and that's going to be perfect for adding our little base. And now our next step is to take, this is where we need our extra strong thread, and I've got a double thread, quite long, no knot in the end, we're leaving our tail ends hanging, and I've just started the base here, just this side of the seam, and I'm sewing just a small running stitch. I'm going to sew that right the way around the base, Don't have your stitches too wide, because then you won't get a nice tight little gather. I know there's a few layers to get through, but this will pull it all in nicely. So you just want to make your way around that entire base until you come back to here, and then you'll have your 2 lots of threads trailing there. And now I've gone right the way around. I've got my 2 threads. I've still got my needle on. I've got those there. You see I've got just room to make a tie off there, and I can slip my little base disc in, whether you're using a wooden disc or a made one. I'm going to just tie 1 knot so that I'm ready to pull that in. Polyester filling likes to get everywhere. There we go. So you can see I'm able to pull that in. Now we don't need for this to pull right into here, but we do need enough closure that we're going to be able to glue our base over the top of it. So ideally we want it about as tight as that, with this much exposed. Now the tricky part of course is doing your 2nd knot and your 3rd knot, and you will need to knot it off a couple of times. So this is when you want to be an octopus. You've got to try and hold it down and tie your knots. It's easier if you've got someone to help you. Can I have your finger for a minute? And you know, there's not one child growing up of all of my children who haven't had the task of being the knot holder, and with great trepidation, and with me saying, don't you dare let go of that knot. So they could all attest to that. So I'm going to knot those off. It's probably easier to squeeze it between your knees, and I will not show you that image, and I'll tie it off, and then we will come back. So there you can see I've got that all stitched up there now. I've actually, because my needle was still on, I went around another time. So now that's all neat and tidy, and we're going to add our little felt bases. Now you can just glue that one straight on. I actually like to cut a few little scraps of felt like I have here. I don't know why, I just like to fill in that little circle so that I'm working with a flat base. It's not important, you don't have to do it. I guess I just like things all very neat and tidy like that. So I just add my little, and I find that 3 pieces just does it nicely, because it's quite a bit of bulk there, quite a few layers. And when I put my disc on, I like that there's not a little dip in the middle. No one particularly sees under there, but I know it's there. So I've got that little area nicely plugged now, and now I can just add my glue to my base. I'm using a clear craft glue here, the one I always use. It's for fabric, and it is quite quick drying. And I'm just going to position that little one. Make sure you check from all angles that you're getting that in the right spot before you push that down. Give that a good squeeze, and then we can set that one aside to dry. Now while that one's drying, that little base there, we're going to pop that one aside. We're going to get working on some of our little details. Now we're going to start with our little comb here, and we just take our backing papers off. And we're going to be putting those together, wrong sides together. So our little glue is in the middle, our little heat and bond glue. We want to line it all up, and this is a little bit tricky. We're going to take that one to the iron, and we're going to fuse only that very top edge together, just for the very top of the comb. we want this section to be left open because we're actually going to sew a seam and then we're going to split it so that we can stitch it onto the head. I don't know if you can see that there. We open that little seam up and that way we get a really nice comb that sits up and it actually looks quite realistic. So be careful and just use your iron just on the very tips there to fuse those two pieces together. And there I've got just the top section fused together. This little section even here is still open, but those three little scallops, they are joined together and this base section is still open. So you might think, why didn't we just glue that? It's because I want the heat and bond on the back of the felt that gives us that extra strength when we're sewing it to the top of the head. Otherwise the felt can tend to dissipate and fall apart a little. So this section, we've got the heat and bond on there just for strength. So our next step is to go to our machine and sew. You can see where the little seam is supposed to start. It's right here on the corner of each one. And we're going to sew a little seam around there, and it's about 3 to 4 millimeters, and in a matching thread so that you really can't see that, and then we'll be able to split that little seam open. Alright, so we'll go ahead and sew that one and I'll show you what that looks like. So that's what that little seam should look like there. I hope you can see that well enough. You can see that I'm going to be able to open that one out all the way along and make it nice and flat, and then we will be able to attach that easily to the top of our little chicken's head there. You see that curve follows the head nicely too. The pattern is very accurate. There we go. So that's how it should look. And our next step is we're going to blanket stitch the entire top edge. Now this time I'm using a candy pink colour because I want it to show up because the rest of my chicken's colours are quite dark. So I'm going to come in from between those layers there where I can hide my knot underneath. That will be hidden when it is glued to the head. And I'm just going to sew the same little blanket stitch as we did before. The same blanket stitch that we did for the tail I'm using here now, only of course it's quite tiny. So really tiny little stitches, but the stitch is the same. And I'm using my extra strong Gutermann thread because all of my fine stitching that I do, that's the thread that I use. It doesn't have to be Gutermann, it can be any brand as long as it's a top stitching thread. And it's an extra strong. And you can see that that's going to give it that nice little edge. Such a professional finish. Now, do you have to do this? No, I guess you don't. I think though these little details are what make this little project really stand out, because it's a fairly plain little project really, quite simple in its shape and design. So I think these little additions make all the difference. You can see how that's going to come up there. So I'm going to make my way across the whole top of the comb to the base here. Once you have your stitching done, then I want you to really open out that seam. You want to get that seam as open and as flat as you can. Really pull it open and press it out with your fingers, because we're going to add that to the top of the head now. We need a little bit of craft glue in that seam. Not too much because we don't want that overflowing. And we have our pins ready. And we're just going to situate that right on that seam. You'll see where that'll go, just at the very crest of his forehead there. We want to fully line it up with that top seam, keeping that little base seam open and flat, which we can encourage by adding our pins right in the centre there. While that's drying, anchor the front and the back exactly where it should be. And reinforce the other side. Make sure you follow all the way down our blunt pins, keeping that seam nice and flat. Really push those pin heads down. And that's really going to hold that one into position while that glue dries. Check you've got it all straight, look at it from every angle. And we've got our little comb. It's quite easy to stitch on, but we don't even go there until that's nice and dry. So let's move forward to our other little body parts. And we have our little wattle pieces. Now our little wattle pieces are these little pieces, and they are cut from double felt, and they are done in the same way. They are treated in the same way that I just did the top of this comb, and we sew a little blanket stitch right around the outside of each one. Now I've already done mine, as you can see here. You see I've hidden my knots behind the top section. Because it's double felt, you can slip your needle in between those two layers of felt. It's thick enough for you to do that. Now we won't see those little knots because that's how that one is going to be added. You can also see that I've added my little eye position in there already. So I put a little dot there that's right in the center of that section there, ready. Now when you're sewing the blanket stitch on these little pieces, it's actually really important that you sew the blanket stitch on the side facing you, the side that's going to be exposed. Now the reason for that is, as you sew your blanket stitch and you're pulling it in all nice and tight, it will naturally follow the curve of your hand and your fingers, which means you'll end up with a little, it's got a little curve to it. You can see it's nicely rounded, and that's how we want it to sit on the little face. We want it to curl around her chin there. It also has heat and bond in between those layers, remember. So as you're holding it and you're stitching it, the warmth from your hand is heating up that heat and bond again, and it's resetting in that nice little curved shape. So you can see I've got that one, and then I've got that one is doing exactly the same thing. It's got that lovely little curve to it that will sit the other side. So that's how you sew those up, ready to be added. And we do the same thing with our beak. So a little beak section. Again, we've got the heat and bond on there. It's only for strength. So we remove those papers. And we match up our little beak, and we're putting our glued sides together, and that's just for extra strength. And we just blanket stitch around the lower point as I have there, and I've done it in a red just to really mark out the edge of that beak. And you can see that I've still got my little beak, can still be opened up, which is exactly what we need, because that little beak is going to sit straight over the end of our little chicken's face there. So that's those little body parts. So once you've got those stitched up, we can go ahead and we're going to add our little beak, because we've got this one drying and we've got this one drying underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the absolute tiniest little bit of filling to the front of this little beak here. Easier with forceps. Open it out and you'll probably feel like, well, I'm never going to get that in there and it's never going to stay in there, and it really is just the tiniest amount that you need. But just keep tucking it in there and holding it. And you can get your little felting needle again, but be very, very careful. Just going to encourage those fibres down there and that they stay put. Once you have everything sitting where you want it, so there's just a little bit of filling there. I'm just going to throw a pin in there for the minute, and then we're going to add a little bit of glue to the very end. Now we don't add it to the beak. If you try and add glue into the inside of the beak, all that will happen is your glue will get caught on your filling and you pull your glue out and all your filling will come out with it. So we add the glue to the end of our little beak, and that's right at the very end. You don't need too much because we're actually going to be stitching it on. Just to hold it in place. Going to open up that little beak, give it a little squeeze at the sides and pop that little one on there. Make sure we've got it all nice and straight, and you ideally want to get that beak sitting up as far as you can. And you want to pull it up and add your pins. I know these pieces seem a little fiddly, but such a good result at the end when your beak is sitting over it like this, rather than a horrible little piece of triangle felt that pokes out. Again, make sure that you've got all of your edges really pinned down. Make sure everything's sitting nice and straight. And again, we're just going to let that one dry. Okay, so check we've got all that right. And those pieces are just going to sit there and they're going to dry nicely. So you see we've got enough filling in there just to fill out that tip, and the rest of that front part of the little chicken's face fills out the rest of our beak there, and it's actually quite easy to stitch on. So we're going to put him aside and he can dry. So now we can move forward and we can start looking at doing our sewing on our wings. Now this is my first wing, which I have already done. So now our first step is to add our little wing piece, and you can see that I leave a little space around it for stitching. As I have here, there's a little space, gives me room for my blanket stitching and for my blanket applique. So I'm just going to press that one into place with a hot iron and a protective cloth. Now I have my little wing piece pressed into place. I can go ahead and I'm going to sew a blanket applique stitch. I'm using my pearl thread. I've come in from behind, right from the center, and taken my needle out because once my little wing is on my little chicken, this side won't be seen at this top edge. So I tend to start at the upper edge, never start on a complex part, or I start on a nice free section there. And I'm just going to be sewing a blanket applique stitch. So I've come out right on the edge of that little shape there. My stitches are going to be quite small, probably around about probably about 3 millimeters. For this one, I like this stitching too on here. Now here with these wings, you could get really creative with these. You could sew a beaded blanket applique stitch by adding a bead between each stitch, which would be fabulous. There's so many different things that you could do. You could put buttons all over the wings, you could add little trims, ric-rac, all sorts of things. So you can see that I'm just going to make my way around. Blanket applique is simply going in on your little shape that you're outlining and coming out right on the edge, and coming out as you do with a blanket stitch through the loop. Now I do have a video that shows you exactly how to sew this stitch, and I will put that link up there for you. So I'm going to make my way right around that little heart shape. And once I've got my little stitching done on my outer heart, I can now go ahead and sew my blanket stitch around the entire outside of that little wing. Again, I've come in from behind, from the center, gone through those 2 layers and come out right on the edge. The blanket stitch that we're sewing is the same one that we did on the back of those little tail feathers there. So you can go ahead and make your way right around that little wing shape. There we go, so that I have both my little wings finished, and we add those close to the end so we can pop those aside. So now let's start attaching our little comb to the top of our head. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is I've got my extra strong thread in a matching thread, matching the comb. I'm going to come in, I've got a knot at the end, I'm going to come in just at the side of the head here, and I want to come out just about, I'm aiming for my green pin there. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that little hole that I just went into there. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger with my awl. Just opening those felt fibres there. And I can usually pop that knot in. You see that that little knot has disappeared into the head. I can close those fibres. And now I can just start my stitching. Now it's a little, I guess you'd call it a slip stitch. And it's just a matter of taking little stitches either side. It doesn't look like much of a seam there, but you'll find it's just enough room to be able to stitch that little one into place. So backtracking on yourself and coming out close to that edge. You can see now why I kept that heat and bond on there, because we need that edge to be quite strong. So if you keep your stitches nice and tiny and you've got a really good matching thread, you won't be able to see much there at all. So it's just a matter of making your way along. And of course you can push that comb out of the way each side as you go. Remove your pins as you go once you feel confident that your stitches are holding it. I'll pull that one out. And you can see I'm just going to work my way along. Make sure you really anchor down that front. Then I'll come around here and I'll do exactly the same all the way down to the base there and really anchor the base. And that has settled my comb nicely into place. That's very strong there. And so my next step is we're going to do the same thing, same technique for sewing on that beak. However, first I'm going to put in just a couple of little nostril marks. You can see I've marked a couple of tiny marks there with my black marker. I've got my extra strong Gutermann thread again in black. I'm going to come in at the side of the head here like I did before, because I'm going to be able to hide that knot, and I'm going to come out right on that little mark that I've made there, very close to it. And I'm going to do the same thing to hide that little knot. Okay, that little pop when that goes in. And I'm just going to take one little stitch and travel across to the other side. Ideally, I'm also taking in some of that beak section that's underneath there. So that's also helping hold our little beak on. So this is really just pulling in a couple of tiny little marks to create that. The little nostrils. It's probably got a more scientific name than nostril, but we'll go with nostril. So I just like to do 2 little stitches either side. So it's just back and forth and pulling it in a little as you go. Create a little bit of sculpting there. Dive back in and come out. You see that's created just that lovely little shape there. All adds to the detail. As far as casting off, it's really about passing your needle through, going back into the same hole each time. Just a couple of times. I try and focus on the area where my little wattle's going to be. Do that a couple of times and then you'll just find you can just snip your thread end off. Because that little thread has woven through the head, that's not going to pull out. That's just a little soft sculpture trick. Okay, and so now we'll get our thread. Now I'm going to be using, because I've only got orange in, and I don't usually use embroidery thread, stranded cotton, but I will today. And I'll be using 2 strands. I don't usually use stranded cotton, but it's the only orange I have. So I don't use it because I don't like that it's separate strands. I like everything to be all neat. But we're going to go with it today. So I've got a knot in the end, and this time I'm going to hide my knot in that beak section. So you can see I'm sliding my needle in under that beak section and I'm coming out right on the edge there. My little knot will go in there and you can see that that's nicely hidden in there. So now we're going to do exactly the same as we did when we were sewing on the comb, where we're just going to take a little bit of the head and a little bit of the beak. And our little tiny stitches, because we've got a good colour match, it's fine to see those little tiny stitches. And I always start at the bottom. And I'm just going to make my way around that whole edge, pulling out my pins as I go and making sure it's all very secure. And now I have my beak on, and now we're just going to sew our little blanket stitch around our base now that that one is also dry. And I've just come in with my pearl thread and I've just come in under that little disc there and hid my knot in behind here, and I'm just going to sew that little blanket applique stitch, which is going to attach that little base to that edge there. It's probably easier to see on this little one there, and that just gives you a lovely little finish there on that base. Hop in there, little chickie. bit hard to see mine because it's black, but I'll just make my way around that whole base. Make sure that each time that you're catching some of that top fabric there, so that's really bonded together. And that's my little base disc, all nicely stitched in place there. So our next step is to add our little eye wattle pieces. Now we're going to be just temporarily gluing those into place. It makes it easier for us to stitch our eyes in. Sewing our eyes in is how we actually attach them. So I've got my clear craft glue ready, and you can see that what I've done. Now remember that we had little marks made there in our little top of our little wattle pieces, which of course is the smaller end, and I've put my pin right through that center, and the same on the other side. Now what I've done is I've lined those up. Ideally you want your little wattle piece to be sitting just a little way forward. We want to encourage them to turn inwards rather than outwards, and you need to check that you've got them the same either side. Sometimes your stuffing is different, may sit a little differently either side. So look at it from every angle. Once you've got them nice and even, I just like to, I've got a pin through both, so I like to just hold my finger there. I'm going to pull that pin out a little way, and I'm going to add some glue in behind there, not directly around the pin. And this really is just a little bit to hold it in place before we stitch it. Push my pin back in, it'll go into the right place. Hold that down. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. So just pulling that pin out, adding a little bit of glue in that section, and pushing that pin back in. So I know that piece isn't going to move, and the little angles are going to be right of those little wattle pieces. So my pin's going to hold that in place there. And we're going to want to let that one dry, because we're going to be adding the little buttons or beads, whatever you're using for the eyes, and we're going to be going backwards and forwards through, so we don't need those little wattle pieces moving. So we can carry on now. We can put this little one aside to dry there for a bit. We can carry on, and if you're making a little chick, which of course you will, why would you not, we can go ahead with her. So you can see there that I've got my two little pieces, my two little chick pieces that have the heat and bond on the back. Of course the paper's removed, and I've sewn that same tiny little blanket stitch that I've used throughout the pattern to join those edges together, but I've left her back open there. And so that is going to allow me to add some filling, but before I do that, I'm going to add a few little stitches right here at the front of her little face to indicate a little bit of a beak. And so to do that, I've got my stranded cotton again in my orange. I've opened up those two layers and I've slid my needle in. I'm coming in from the inside because that just allows me to hide my knot in there. And I'm just going to come out one side. Make sure you're not catching any of the layers. Oops. Pull that one through so that little knot is hidden. You notice I've still got my thread hanging. And I'll sew basically just a couple of blanket stitches over that edge. It's really just to create a little bit of a orange section there for the beak. I can make a tiny knot. And then I can pop my needle back in again between those layers. Make sure I'm not catching anything. And now I can just add my little bit of polyester filling, and my little tiny forceps are great for this. We just need to fill this, just to give this little chick just a little bit of substance. She's not very 3D, but she can take a little bit of filling. Start with the head section, fill out that beak section, and pack her all out right until this top edge here. Remember to use your felting needle to pack all that in there, because these little pieces are a bit tricky to keep all that filling in, but a felting needle does it for you. So now before we close this little opening, you can see I've just put 2 little marks, just the same way that we did with the little nostrils on our little chicken. I've got a mark on each side, and while this back is open, I've got a knot in the end. I'm using my same black extra strong Gutermann thread, and I'm going to come in and come out right on one of those little eye marks there, or right close to it. That way my knot's going to be hidden within the body. I'll be able to tuck that nicely in there, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to pass through a couple of times right on those little eye spots. Just pulling it in a little, tiny little bit of sculpting there. It's really just looking for a little indication of a little eye. 2 stitches on each will do it. You could use a tiny bead. I think that would drive me crazy, but you could. Going to come out of the back. I'll do the same thing where I just pass through the body a couple of times. The beauty of felt, it hides a multitude of sins. And then we can just snip that one off. And now it's simply a matter of rethreading your needle with your thread that you've got hanging from when you sewed it up, and just closing that little opening, continuing on with your little blanket stitch. And that's our finished little chickie, and she can wait here with the other mama. There we go, you can hold that one too, mama chicken, while we get her mama ready. Alright, so our next step now is to sew on our little eyes through both those layers. So if you're using a little bead, it's maybe, I don't know if it's a bit easier with a little bead, but my buttons are exactly the right size, but they have very tiny holes, so I have to use a normal sewing machine thread, which is so foreign to me. I much prefer extra strong thread for absolutely everything, but otherwise the build-up will be too much and my needle won't pass through those little holes. So the way that I begin is that I'm going to start on the opposite side. So I'm going to lift up this little wattle, and I'm going to tuck my needle in underneath there so that we can't see anything, and I'm going to come out. I want to come out right on that little spot, or right near it. You can see that I'm leaving my pins in. I'm going to leave them in for as long as I can. I know that that's glued. Your forceps can come in handy through this for pulling your needles through. Now I've got a knot in the end, so that knot will just be hidden underneath the wattle on the other side. And I take my needle through my little button, through the back, then back through the front, take that pin out, and then I'm going to dive in right where that spot was, and I'm going to be coming out on the other side right where that little mark is. So it all takes a little bit of jiggling, but it's not a very wide head, so it's not too difficult. So there we go. Again, I'm going to use my little forceps, pull that one through. Because I'm using normal thread, I can't be pulling too hard as I would normally with my extra strong. I want to make sure that my threads aren't twisted as that little button goes into place. I want that to sit nice and flat. So there's my little button. So then I will add this little button on the other side, the same way I just did that one. And I'll then pass my needle to and fro throughout both buttons as I go, probably, because I'm using this thread, probably about 5 times, so that they're really held in. You can give it a good squeeze as you go. As you get a few build up, then you can really tug on your thread, and that will just pull those little buttons in, give you a little bit of sculpting there in the eyes. So it's very difficult for me to show you on camera. But I will show you the end result, and when I'm finished I will actually just come out underneath as I did before and make a little knot and tie off there, because that won't be seen underneath there. So I'm just going to go ahead and get those little eyes into place. So what I've done there is, now that I've got my little eyes in place there, I've just thrown a pin in either side there just for while we're finishing off. That's just encouraging that little wattle section to sit nicely under the chin. I'm just giving her a little shave there. And our next step is to add our wings. Now your wing position, you can see there exactly where I have them. So we want to show off a nice full front there. So they do sit back a little, and you do want them to sit down just over that edge there. Of course, we're using a button to join these, so they will be able to shift just a little, but you'll find that they'll sit quite snug. So what you want to do is put a mark in the center exactly where your button is going to go. That's where my pin is, and I've got a mark on my chicken. Now I've made sure that my wings are the same either side, so you need to look at your little chicken from every angle, top and bottom, and to check that you're getting them the right height and even on both sides. So once you've done that, of course, you can remove your other wing, and we're going to start with our button. You can use a 2-hole or a 4-hole, it doesn't matter. We're only using 2 of the holes in our button, and we're first going to pass through the front of the button. We've got a doubled threaded needle of extra strong thread, something that will coordinate. So I've gone through the front of my button, and now I'm going to go, there is a mark there, you can see, I'm going to go through just to the side of that mark, and then I'm going to go to my mark, I'm going to go just to the side of it, and I'm going to dig right in, take up some of that filling and across just a little, and come across. Then we're going to come out just the other side of our little mark, and the other side of our button. So what we've got is our little wing on a little hinge there, and all we need to do is tie off. This is where you need to be an octopus again. We want to knot off one time and then really squeeze that in tight. Pull it as tight as you can, finger on that knot, and knot off about 2 or 3 more times. Once you've done that, you can then re-thread your ends and dive your needle back into your chicken, come out somewhere and snip off, because then you will lose your thread ends in there. So just a simple matter, pushing that one in, tying it off as tight as you can, knotting it off and losing those thread ends into your chicken. And there we go, her little wings are on and she's able to hold her little baby now. So what a beautiful little project. How good would these be at craft markets? They would be amazing. And of course, I've called her a pincushion because I guess she could be a pincushion. She makes a fabulous pincushion, and actually all your little clippies can go all over her, your pins and needles, and she's a great little size for a pincushion. I think you all know that I like a bigger pincushion. And of course you can make her a couple of chicks for each of them. Also with those little, mine's just for display, so I don't worry about it, but if you really wanted those wings to tuck in, of course you can just throw a stitch in either side. I would just go back and forth through the body and just tuck those little wings in, especially if you're making them and selling them as a little sewing caddy. That just means that little chick is really tucked in there, which is really sweet. I can't wait to see what you all do with them in fabric and all of your little extra little detailing. I'm sure they'll be absolutely fabulous. You can make a whole chicken ranch. So that's it today for our little chicken, but you all come back now, you're here. So we'll see you next time. Well, thank you all for joining me today with this little chicken project. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did too. If you did, you could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beaut. And how are you feeling about the variation of the patterns that are happening? I'm trying to keep it all varied and all at different skill levels for you all. Is anybody interested in patterns that include jointing? You know, I've got my jointing video that tells you how to make your own joints, so it's very inexpensive. Let me know in the comments if you want to see some more patterns that include joints, because I can design some incredible things for you all. But some of them really do need that jointing technique, so talk to me and let me know. Thank you all so much for your kindness and your encouragement. That's wonderful and it keeps me going. You can follow me on Instagram and you can talk to me on Instagram too, and you can see the little bits and pieces that I do behind the scenes, sometimes sneaky peeks at up and coming projects. And of course you can send me photographs as you have been doing, and your work is incredible. I feel very honoured that you're sharing it with me. Thank you so much. Skill level is amazing. You know who I'm talking to. All of you are sending me these great photos. So I like to post them on my Pinterest board that's all set up just for you. So let's keep those photos coming. Now, if you haven't subscribed, I really hope you do, because there's so many free patterns coming up. And imagine if you'd missed this one. No one wants to miss this one. So ahead there's so many free patterns. They're always going to be free, and I have no intention of stopping, so let's just keep going on with it, hey? So in the meantime, anything that good comes to you in your day, make sure you don't just keep it for yourself, make sure you share it and pay it forward. And until next time, it's hooroo from me.